I stuffed my sleeping bag into the bottom of my backpack, trying to remember if I'd packed everything on the list I'd made 3 weeks ago. The excitement still hummed in my chest. 3 days away from spreadsheets and conference calls, 3 days in actual wilderness with 2 of my closest friends. My hiking boots felt stiff around my ankles, still breaking in from the sporting goods store. But I didn't care. This trip was exactly what I needed. "You bringing the whole REI catalog with you?" John called out from across Sean's driveway, already leaning against the truck with that familiar grin. His sandy hair stuck up at odd angles like he'd just rolled out of bed, which he probably had. The flask appeared in his hand as if by magic, catching the morning light as he unscrewed the cap. "It's 9 in the morning," I said, shouldering my pack. "And?" John took a swig and offered it to me. Trail bourbon builds character. I waved him off and watched Sean load his gear into the truck bed. Everything he owned looked military issued or professional grade. His pack was some tactical model I'd never heard of, and his knife hung from his belt in a worn leather sheath. His movements had that careful precision that made me feel like I was still playing dress-up in my moisture-wicking shirt and convertible hiking pants. "Maps?" I asked, checking my own pack one more time. Sean looked up from arranging his gear, those intense eyes finding mine. "Don't need them. I've hiked this area a dozen times." He patted his compass pocket. "Trust me, I know the Shasta Trinity like my own backyard." "GPS?" "Dave." Sean's voice carried that edge that meant the conversation was over. "I was navigating terrain in Afghanistan while you were sitting in cubicles. We'll be fine." John raised his flask in a mock toast to getting gloriously lost in the wilderness and living on pine nuts and creek water. He took another drink. "Actually, scratch the creek water. I brought enough bourbon to last until Tuesday." I wanted to argue about bringing at least a topographical map, but Sean was already climbing into the driver's seat. The truck engine turned over with a rumble that seemed to settle the matter. I grabbed the passenger door handle and told myself to relax. Sean did know what he was doing. His military background showed in everything from how he packed his gear to the way he'd planned our route. 3 days of hiking, fishing, and actually talking to my friends instead of sending them texts between meetings. What could go wrong? The drive to the trailhead took 2 hours through winding mountain roads that climbed steadily into pine forests. John kept up a running commentary from the back seat about everything from the wildlife we might see to increasingly ridiculous stories about his latest dating disasters. His flask made regular appearances, and I found myself checking the time on my phone. Not even noon, and he was already working on what looked like his second or third drink. "You know what they say about drinking before noon," Sean said, catching John's reflection in the rearview mirror. "Yeah, it means you're either an alcoholic or on vacation." John grinned and capped the flask. "Since I'm definitely not an alcoholic." Sean shook his head but didn't push it. He never did, really. For all his military discipline, he seemed to give John a pass on the drinking thing. Maybe because John was functional about it, or maybe because calling someone out on their habits wasn't worth the hassle. I'd learned over the years that Sean picked his battles carefully. The Crater Lake Trail parking area was smaller than I'd expected, just a gravel lot with a wooden sign and a trail registry book chained to a post. A few other cars sat scattered around, but the place felt quiet and remote in a way that made my office life seem like something from another planet. Sean parked near the trailhead and we climbed out into air that smelled like pine needles and something wild I couldn't name. "Trail starts here," Sean said, consulting his compass and pointing toward a well-marked path that disappeared into the trees. "But we're not taking it." I looked at the clear trail markers and the official Forest Service signs. "Why not?" "Because everyone takes the main trail, tourist route." Sean shouldered his pack and started walking toward a much less obvious gap in the trees about 50 yards to the left. "I know a better way. Better views, fewer people, real wilderness experience." John fell into step behind Sean, already reaching for his flask again. "Lead the way, fearless leader. Dave and I are just along for the scenic tour." I hesitated at the truck. looking back at the marked trail with its reassuring signs and clear path. Everything about this felt like the kind of decision my office worker brain would normally question. Leaving the established route on the first day, trusting someone's memory over actual maps, following an unofficial path into unfamiliar territory. But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? I'd spent too many years playing it safe, taking the marked trails through life. This was supposed to be different. Sean was already 20 feet ahead, moving with confident strides through bushes that seemed to part for him. John stumbled slightly on a root but kept going, making a noise under his breath. They both looked like they belonged out here in a way I knew I didn't, but maybe that would change. Maybe 3 days of actual adventure would shake something loose in me. I locked the truck and jogged to catch up, my pack bouncing awkwardly on my shoulders. The unmarked path, if it could even be called a path, wound between massive pines and over fallen logs that Sean stepped over without breaking stride. Branches grabbed at my sleeves and my boots slipped on loose pine needles, but I kept moving forward. For the first hour, Sean's confidence seemed right. The terrain opened up periodically to reveal distant mountain peaks and valleys that the main trail probably never touched. John kept the mood light with a steady stream of commentary about everything from the size of the trees to speculation about what kind of wildlife we might encounter. "Bear?" he asked, stopping to examine some scratches on a tree trunk. "Probably," Sean said without slowing down. "Black bears mostly. They're more afraid of you than you are of them." "What about mountain lions?" "Unlikely. They avoid groups." "Bigfoot?" Sean shot him a look over his shoulder. "There's no such thing as Bigfoot." "That's exactly what Bigfoot wants you to think," John said, taking another drink. "Perfect camouflage." But by early afternoon, something had changed in Sean's posture. He stopped more frequently to check his compass, and his confident steps became more hesitant. The terrain around us looked increasingly unfamiliar. Thick stands of pine and fir with no distinguishing landmarks, no obvious ridgelines or creek beds to provide navigation points. The bushes grew thicker and more tangled, forcing us to push through branches that snapped back and caught on our packs. "Everything okay?" I asked when Sean stopped for the third time in 10 minutes to study his compass. "Fine," he said without looking up. "Just getting our bearings." John flopped down on a fallen log and pulled out his flask. Translation: "We're lost as hell." "We're not lost." Sean's voice had that edge again, sharper this time. "I know exactly where we are." I looked around at the endless repetition of tree trunks and shadows, trying to spot anything that looked known from our earlier path or any sign of the trail we'd left behind. Everything looked the same. Pine needles and fallen branches and more trees stretching in every direction. No trail markers, no cleared paths, no indication that humans had ever been through this area before. "Maybe we should head back," I said. "Retrace our steps to the parking lot and start over on the marked trail." Sean's head snapped up from the compass. "We're not going back." "I'm just saying—" "I said we're not going back." His voice carried that command tone that probably worked great on soldiers but made my stomach clench. "What are you, afraid of a little real hiking? This isn't some mall nature walk, Dave. This is actual wilderness." John raised his flask. "To actual wilderness, and the actual possibility that we'll be eating bark by Thursday." "We'll be fine," Sean said, but he was looking at his compass again instead of at either of us. "Another hour or two and we'll hit the ridge. From there, it's easy navigation to the lake." I wanted to ask which lake he meant, since I couldn't remember him mentioning any lakes in his original description of the route. But the way he stood there with his shoulders set and his jaw tight told me that questioning him further wouldn't get me anywhere except deeper into whatever was building between his confidence and the reality of our situation. We kept moving, pushing through increasingly dense forest as the afternoon wore on. The cover above us grew thicker, filtering out most of the daylight and creating a constant twilight that made it hard to judge time or direction. My legs started to ache from the uneven terrain, and sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool air under the trees. John's jokes became less frequent and more forced. He still pulled out his flask regularly, but the humor felt strained now, like he was working harder to keep the mood light. Sean maintained his military bearing, but I caught him checking his compass more often and noticed how his eyes moved constantly through the trees, as if searching for something he recognized. When we finally stopped to set up camp, it wasn't because Sean had found his intended destination. It was because we'd stumbled into a small clearing next to a creek, and the light filtering through the trees had faded enough that continuing seemed dangerous. Sean announced it like it had been his plan all along, but the way he immediately pulled out his compass and spent several minutes studying it told a different story. "Nice spot," John said, though his voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. He sat heavily on a rock and took a long drink from his flask. "Very remote." I dropped my pack and looked around the clearing. It was pretty enough, maybe 30 feet across, with a stream running along one edge and decent ground for tents. But there was something about the way the trees pressed in around the edges that made it feel isolated rather than peaceful. No sounds of other hikers, no distant traffic noise, no indication that civilization existed anywhere within walking distance. Sean set up his tent with quick, efficient movements, but I watched him pause several times to look around the clearing like he was trying to memorize details or spot something he'd missed. When he thought neither of us was watching, he studied his compass again, looking unhappy at the needle like it was giving him information he didn't want to accept. I pitched my own tent across the clearing and tried to shake off the worry that had been building all afternoon. This was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to do something different and challenging. Getting a little lost was part of the experience, wasn't it? Sean was experienced and capable. He'd figure out where we were by morning and get us back on track. But as I worked on setting up my camp, organizing my gear and filtering water from the creek, a cold realization settled in my chest that I couldn't ignore anymore. None of us actually knew where we were. Sean's confidence had been covering up the fact that his mental map of the area didn't match the terrain we'd been hiking through. John's jokes were getting more nervous and his drinking more frequent. And I, the cautious office worker who'd wanted to bring maps and GPS, was completely dependent on two people who were just as lost as I was. The creek bubbled softly in the growing darkness, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called, once before falling silent. I finished setting up my camp and stood in the middle of the clearing, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying to convince myself that everything would look different in the morning. The flames crackled between us as John pulled out his flask for what had to be the 10th time since dinner. He'd been working on trail mix and energy bars, while Sean and I had chosen the dehydrated camping meals we'd packed, but none of us seemed particularly hungry. The day of hiking through unmarked terrain had left us all drained in different ways. "So this bartender in Redding," John said, unscrewing the cap with practiced ease. "Real chatty guy. Probably been pouring drinks since the Carter administration. He starts telling me about this thing that lives up in these mountains." Sean poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. "Here we go." "No, seriously. Listen to this." John took a drink and leaned forward, his face animated in the firelight. "He says there's this creature, been around for decades, something between a bear and a man, walks on two legs but bigger than any human, hunts hikers who get too far off the marked trails." "Tourist nonsense," Sean said without looking up from the fire. "Local bars love that crap. Keeps people buying drinks and talking about how mysterious and dangerous the wilderness is." John shrugged and took another swig. "Maybe, but he seemed pretty serious about it. Said it goes after people who think they know better than the trail markers, who want to explore the real wilderness instead of sticking to the safe paths." I moved on the log I was using as a seat, trying to find a more comfortable position. Something about John's story made my skin crawl, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was just the isolation of our situation, the way the darkness pressed in around our small circle of firelight. Did he say what it looked like? I asked, more to keep the conversation going than out of real curiosity. Big, really big, 8 feet tall, maybe more, arms that hang down past its knees, claws that can tear through tree bark like paper. John gestured with his flask, sloshing the contents. Face like a nightmare, he said. Human enough that you recognize what you're looking at, but wrong in every way that matters. Sean snorted. Sounds like every Bigfoot story ever told. Next, you'll be telling us about UFO sightings and government conspiracies. Hey, I'm just repeating what the guy told me. John raised his hands in mock surrender. Take it or leave it. But as John finished his story, I realized something had changed around us. The forest had gone completely quiet. No insects buzzing, no owls calling from the trees, no rustling of small animals moving through the bushes. Even the usual night sounds I'd gotten used to over the years of camping trips had disappeared entirely. The only sounds were the crackling of our fire and the soft gurgle of the creek running along the edge of our clearing. The silence felt wrong in a way I couldn't put into words. Forests were never truly quiet, especially at night when nocturnal animals became active. There should have been something: bats, crickets, even the distant howl of coyotes. But the darkness beyond our fire seemed to absorb sound rather than produce it. Anyone else notice how quiet it got? I asked. Sean looked up from the fire, his head tilted slightly as he listened. John lowered his flask and glanced around the clearing, his usual grin fading. Yeah, John said slowly. That's weird. We sat in the weird silence for several minutes, each of us trying to hear something normal, something that would break the heavy quiet that had settled over our campsite. But nothing came. No chirping, no rustling, no distant animal calls, just the fire and the creek and our own breathing. Probably just a predator nearby, Sean said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Mountain lion, maybe. When big predators move through an area, smaller animals go quiet until they pass. How long does that usually last? I asked. Sean poked at the fire again, harder this time. Depends. Could be a few minutes, could be longer. I needed to relieve myself anyway, and sitting around speculating about the silence wasn't helping my growing worry. I grabbed the small LED flashlight from my pack and stood up, my legs stiff from sitting on the log. I'll be right back, I said, heading toward the tree line. Don't go too far, Sean called after me. Stay where you can see the fire. I picked my way carefully through the bushes, using my flashlight to avoid tripping over roots or fallen branches. The beam cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, creating more shadows than it got rid of. Every step I took seemed way too loud in the heavy quiet. About 30 feet from the clearing, I found a good spot behind a large oak tree. As I finished and was about to head back to camp, my flashlight beam swept across the trunk of the oak. I stopped, staring at what the light showed. Deep gouges ran down the bark in parallel lines, too regular and deliberate to be random damage. The marks started about 8 feet off the ground and ran down to chest height, each one several inches deep and perfectly spaced. They looked fresh. The exposed wood was still pale, not darkened by weather or age. I moved closer, angling my flashlight to get a better look. The claw marks were massive, far too large for any bear I'd ever heard of. Each individual scratch was wider than my thumb and cut deep enough into the hardwood that removing that much bark and wood would have taken tremendous force. But it wasn't just the size that made my stomach tighten with fear. The marks looked deliberate, methodical, not the random scratches of an animal marking territory or sharpening claws on convenient bark. These cuts had an almost systematic quality, like something had been testing the strength of its claws or practicing precise movements. As I stood there staring at the oak tree, a smell hit me that made my stomach turn, sweet and rotten, like meat left in the sun for days. The odor was strong enough to make me gag, and I instinctively stepped backward, away from both the tree and the smell. I swept my flashlight beam around the immediate area, looking for the source of the stench. but the smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, hanging in the air like an invisible cloud. No dead animal visible, no obvious source for the rotten odor that made me want to breathe through my mouth. I was shaking as I made my way back through the trees toward our campfire. The orange glow looked incredibly welcoming after the heavy darkness, and I hurried the last few steps into the clearing. "Everything okay?" John asked, looking up from his flask. "You look like you saw a ghost." I sat down heavily on my log, trying to organize my thoughts. There are claw marks on that oak tree, big ones, really big. Sean looked over at me, his expression skeptical. How big? 8 feet off the ground, maybe higher, and deep. Whatever made them had to be huge. "Bears can rear up pretty high," Sean said, but he was frowning now. "Black bears especially. They use trees for marking territory. These weren't normal bear scratches." I described the systematic pattern, the deliberate spacing, the depth of the gouges, and there was this smell, like something died and rotted. John took a long drink from his flask, longer than usual. "What kind of smell?" "Sweet and rotten. Made me want to throw up." Sean stood up and grabbed his own flashlight from beside his pack. "I'll take a look." "Sean, you don't have to." "I'll take a look," he repeated firmly. "Probably just a big black bear. They can get up to 300 pounds in this area." But even as he said it, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The same uncertainty that had been creeping in all day as he checked his compass more frequently and admitted, without actually admitting, that we weren't where he'd expected to be. He disappeared into the trees, his flashlight beam dancing between the trunks. John and I sat by the fire, listening to the continued silence of the forest and waiting for Sean to return. John's flask appeared in his hands again, and he took another drink without making his usual joke about trail bourbon. "That story the bartender told you," I said. "Did he say anything else about it?" John was quiet for a moment, looking into the fire. "He said it only goes after people who leave the marked trails, people who think they know better than the Forest Service, who want to find their own way through the wilderness." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. We'd left the marked trail that morning, following Sean's confidence into unmarked territory. We were exactly the kind of hikers the bartender had been talking about. Sean came back from the trees a few minutes later, but his flashlight beam shook more than it should have, and his face looked pale in the firelight. "Well?" I asked. "Bear scratches," he said, but his voice was flat. "Big bear, probably male. Nothing to worry about." "What about the smell?" Sean sat down and picked up his stick to poke at the fire again. "Dead rabbit or something. Predators store their kills sometimes." But he wouldn't meet my eyes, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he stirred the coals. Whatever he'd seen out there had bothered him more than he wanted to admit. John laughed, but the sound came out nervous and forced. "Well, that's reassuring. Giant bears and rotting meat. Exactly what I wanted to hear before bedtime." He took another drink. "Good thing I brought enough bourbon to forget all about it." "We should get some sleep," Sean said, standing up abruptly. "Long day of hiking tomorrow." I wanted to ask him what direction we'd be hiking in since he still hadn't said that we were lost. But the way he was moving, quick and jerky like he wanted to get away from the conversation, told me this wasn't the time for questions about navigation. We put out the fire and went back to our tents. I could hear Sean moving around in his setup, the rustle of his sleeping bag and the zip of compartments as he organized his gear. John was quieter, but I caught the soft sound of his flask being opened one more time before his tent went silent. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark fabric of my tent roof and listening to the weird quiet outside. No insects, no night birds, no small animals moving through the bushes. Just silence so complete it felt heavy, pressing down on our campsite. Every few minutes I found myself holding my breath, trying to hear something that would show we weren't alone out here. But nothing came. No footsteps, no breathing, no sounds of movement beyond our circle of tents. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness beyond where our fire had been. Something patient and still, waiting for us to fall asleep or let our guard down. The feeling was so strong, I could almost feel eyes on me through the fabric of my tent, studying us. I pulled my sleeping bag up higher and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, just the stress of being lost combined with John's ghost story and the strange claw marks. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those deep gouges in the oak bark and smelled that sweet, rotten smell that had made my stomach turn. Hours passed while I lay there listening to the silence and fighting the feeling that we were not alone in these woods. I woke to the sound of Sean moving around outside his tent, the rustle of fabric and clatter of gear that meant he was already packing up. Gray light came through the thin walls of my tent, and I realized I'd actually managed to fall asleep at some point during the long, silent night. My body felt stiff and unrested, like I'd spent hours tensed up and waiting for something that never came. "Rise and shine," Sean called out, his voice carrying that forced cheer that usually meant bad news. "We need to get moving." I unzipped my tent and crawled out, blinking in the pale morning light. John's tent was still zipped shut, and I could hear him moving slowly inside, probably nursing both a hangover and whatever restless sleep he'd managed. Sean stood near the dead coals of our fire, his pack already on his shoulders and his compass in his hand. "So," I said, pulling on my boots, "which way to the trail?" Sean looked up from the compass, and I saw something in his face that made my stomach drop. The military confidence was still there, but underneath it was something that looked like worry, maybe even fear. "We're lost," he said simply. "I'll admit it. I don't know exactly where we are." John's tent rustled, and his head appeared through the opening. His sandy hair stuck up at impossible angles, and his eyes were bloodshot. Did I just hear Sean admit he doesn't know something? I said we're lost, not that I don't know what to do about it. Sean's voice had that edge again, but it sounded defensive rather than authoritative. "We head downhill, find water, follow it downstream. All rivers lead to civilization eventually." I looked around our clearing in the growing daylight. The thick trees pressed in from all sides, and I couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. Everything looked the same. Pine trunks and bushes and shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. "How downhill?" I asked. "This whole area feels pretty flat." Sean pointed toward a gap between two large pines. "That way slopes down gradually. We'll hit water within a few hours, guaranteed." John crawled out of his tent and immediately reached for his flask. He unscrewed the cap and took a long drink. He didn't offer it around this time, didn't make any jokes about trail bourbon or building character. Just drank and stared at the trees like he was seeing them for the first time. We broke camp quickly, Sean setting a pace that felt urgent rather than confident. He moved ahead of us, checking his compass every few minutes, and looked around the forest like he was searching for landmarks that wouldn't appear. I fell into step behind him, my pack bouncing awkwardly as we picked our way through bushes that grew thicker with each passing hour. 20 minutes into our hike, I noticed the first broken branch. It hung at shoulder height from a strong pine, snapped clean through but still attached by a strip of bark. The break looked fresh, and the diameter of the branch was thick enough that it would have taken considerable force to damage it. "Sean," I called out, stopping beneath the hanging branch. "Look at this." He backtracked to where I stood, John joining us a moment later. Sean examined the break, running his fingers along the splintered wood. "Animal damage," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Elk, maybe. They can break branches when they're moving through thick areas." "At shoulder height?" I asked. Sean didn't answer, just turned and kept walking. But I noticed he checked his compass again, and his eyes moved more frequently through the trees around us. We found more broken branches over the next hour, not just one or two, but a scattered trail of them going in roughly the same direction we were traveling. Some hung at shoulder height, others were snapped completely off and lay scattered on the ground. The pattern felt deliberate, like something large had been forcing its way through the forest without concern for the obstacles in its path. "This is a game trail," Sean announced when I pointed out the fourth broken branch. "Animals use the same routes repeatedly. That's why we're seeing consistent damage. But game trails were supposed to be clear paths, worn smooth by generations of hooves and paws. This looked more like something had bulldozed through the forest, breaking whatever got in its way, rather than finding the easiest route around obstacles." John hadn't said a word about the branches. He walked behind us with his flask in his hand, taking regular drinks and looking around the trees with an expression I couldn't figure out. Not fear exactly, but a watchful tension that reminded me of how he'd looked last night when the forest had gone silent. An hour later, I found the claw marks. These were on a different tree, a massive fir about 3 feet in diameter. The gouges ran down the trunk in the same parallel pattern I'd seen the night before, but these marks were even deeper. The exposed wood was pale and fresh, and sap had started to ooze from the deepest cuts. "Sean." He turned back, saw where I was pointing, and walked over to examine the tree. His face went pale as he ran his fingers along the gouges, measuring their depth and spacing. "Bear," he said, but the word came out flat and unconvincing. "What kind of bear makes marks like that?" Sean stepped back from the tree, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt. "Big one. Really big one." But I could see in his face that he didn't believe his own explanation any more than I did. These marks were too deep, too systematic, too deliberately placed to be normal animal behavior. Whatever had made them possessed both intelligence and tremendous strength. John approached the tree and whistled low under his breath. "Those are some serious claws." "We keep moving," Sean said abruptly. "Standing around speculating isn't going to get us unlost." We continued downhill, but now I found myself checking every tree we passed for similar marks. I spotted them on 2 more trunks over the next hour. Always the same pattern, always at the same height, always looking fresh enough to have been made recently. The smell hit us when we stopped for a water break near a small stream. That same sweet, rotten odor I'd run into the night before, but stronger now and coming from somewhere ahead of us. John gagged and pulled his shirt up over his nose. "Jesus, what is that?" Sean checked his compass and pointed downstream. "Something died. Deer, probably. We'll give it a wide berth." But as we walked around the source of the smell, I noticed the bushes in that area were trampled down flat, not browsed by grazing animals or worn by repeated foot traffic, but crushed like something heavy had been dragged across it. The flattened area went for maybe 20 feet in a rough oval shape, and the smell seemed to come from the center of the disturbed ground. "Look at this," John said from behind a thorn bush. I turned to see him holding up a piece of fabric, faded blue denim that had been torn into a triangular strip about 6 inches long. The edges were frayed and the color was sun-bleached, but it was definitely from human clothing. A pocket corner, maybe, or part of a pant leg. Sean took the fabric and looked at it closely. Could have been here for years. Hikers lose gear all the time. Or get it torn off, John said quietly. The fabric looked old, worn by seasons of rain and sun and snow. But finding it here, in this area where the bushes had been trampled and the smell of decay hung in the air, made my skin crawl. I thought about all the missing hiker reports I'd read online over the years, all the people who'd walked into wilderness areas and simply disappeared. "We should go," I said. "Right now." Sean nodded and started walking downstream, but I could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his head moved constantly as he looked around the forest around us. His military bearing was starting to crack, and for the first time since we'd left the marked trail, he looked genuinely worried rather than just frustrated. John pocketed the piece of fabric and took another long drink from his flask. He'd been drinking steadily all morning, more frequently than usual, and I realized he was working on what had to be his third flask since we'd started hiking. The alcohol didn't seem to be affecting his balance or coordination, but his eyes had that glassy look that meant he was using it to maintain his composure. "Sean," I said as we walked, "have you ever seen animals sign like this before? I mean, in all your hiking and military experience?" He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he stopped walking and turned to face me, his compass still in his hand. "No," he said simply. "I've never seen anything like this." The admission hit me harder than I'd expected. Sean was supposed to be the expert, the one with wilderness experience and military training. If he was admitting that these signs were outside his knowledge, then we were dealing with something genuinely unknown. We found the clearing an hour later, and it stopped all three of us in our tracks. The grass in the center was stained dark brown in patches that looked like dried blood. Not just a few drops or spatters, but large areas where something had soaked into the ground and left permanent discoloration. Around the edges of the clearing, rocks had been placed in a pattern that definitely wasn't natural. Not a circle or any recognizable shape, but a deliberate placement that looked almost like markers or boundary stones. "What the hell is this?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I counted 7 rocks, each about the size of a basketball and positioned at uneven spots around the clearing's edge. They didn't match the local geology. These were smooth river stones, probably carried here from somewhere else. The dark stains in the grass went between several of the rocks, connecting them in a pattern that looked intentional. Sean walked to the center of the clearing and knelt beside one of the dark patches. He touched the stained ground with his finger, then looked at the dirt closely. "This is old," he said. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't recent." "That makes it better, somehow," I asked. Sean stood up and looked around the clearing, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "We're leaving, right now." "Maybe we should go back," I said. "Retrace our steps, find the parking lot, start over with proper maps, and..." "We can't retrace our steps." Sean's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know the way back. I don't know where we came from or how to get there." The admission hung in the air between us. Sean, the confident military veteran who'd dismissed my suggestions about maps and GPS, was completely lost. Not just uncertain about our current location, but genuinely without any idea how to return to familiar territory. John took another long drink from his flask and looked at the arranged rocks. "So what's the plan?" "We keep going downstream," Sean said, but his voice sounded hollow. "Water always leads to civilization eventually." "What if it doesn't?" I asked. "What if we're heading deeper into wilderness?" Sean turned to look at me, and I saw fear in his eyes that matched what I'd been feeling since we'd left the marked trail. "Then we figure something else out, but we can't stay here." By late afternoon, we were all stumbling with exhaustion. The terrain had grown increasingly difficult, forcing us to climb over fallen logs and push through dense bushes and plants that scratched at our clothes and caught on our packs. The stream we'd been following had split and rejoined multiple times, leaving us uncertain which branch to follow. John hadn't said more than a few words in hours. He walked behind us with mechanical precision, his flask appearing in his hand every few minutes like a nervous tick. I'd stopped counting how many drinks he'd taken, but his face had that flushed look that meant he was well past buzzed and approaching genuinely drunk. "We need to stop," I called out when Sean showed no signs of slowing down. "I can't keep this pace." Sean turned around, and I saw that his face was streaked with sweat, and his eyes had that wild look of someone operating on pure adrenaline. "We have to keep moving. We have to find our way out of here. Sean, it's getting dark. We need to make camp." He looked up at the sky through the canopy, where the light was definitely fading toward evening. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment he looked less like a military veteran and more like a lost, exhausted man who'd run out of options. "Fine," he said. "We'll camp here." Here was another clearing. This one smaller than our previous campsites and surrounded by thick pine trees that blocked most of the remaining daylight. The trees felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides and creating a sense of enclosure that made me think of a trap or a cage. We set up our tents in mechanical silence, each of us too tired and too worried to maintain conversation. John's hands shook as he worked on his tent stakes, whether from alcohol or exhaustion or fear, I couldn't tell. Sean's movements were quick and jerky, like he was fighting the urge to keep walking into the growing darkness. As I finished setting up my tent, I realized we hadn't heard any normal forest sounds all day. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, no insects buzzing in the bushes. The same unnatural silence that had settled over our campsite the night before seemed to be following us, creating a bubble of quiet that moved with us through the forest. I looked up at the cover of pine branches overhead, where almost no light penetrated to reach our campsite. Whatever was out there, watching us from the darkness beyond our small circle of safety, felt closer tonight. More patient. Like it was waiting for us to make the mistake that would give it the opportunity it had been planning for. I pressed my ear against the fabric of my tent, trying to hear something beyond the heavy quiet that had followed us through the forest. Hours had passed since we'd made camp, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those arranged rocks and the dark stains in the grass, the deliberate claw marks cut deep into tree bark. The silence felt alive somehow, like it was breathing around our small circle of tents. No insects, no night birds, no rustling of small animals moving through the bushes. Just the faint sound of the stream somewhere beyond the trees, and our own careful breathing as we tried to convince ourselves we were safe. I rolled onto my side and checked my watch. Nearly 2 a.m. Sean's tent was a dark shape maybe 10 feet away, and beyond that, John's setup looked like a small blue mound in the deeper shadows under the pines. Both were silent, though I doubted either of my friends was sleeping any better than I was. Something had been watching us all day. I felt it with the same certainty I felt the cold mountain air seeping through the thin walls of my tent. Patient and intelligent, following our progress through the forest, and waiting for the right moment to... John's scream ripped through the night like a blade. The sound came from his tent, high-pitched and full of terror, cutting through the silence with such sudden violence that I sat up fast. My sleeping bag tangled around my legs as more sounds came from John's direction. Thrashing, the rustle of fabric being torn, heavy impacts against the ground. "Help!" John's voice carried across the clearing, strained and desperate. "Oh God, help me, it's..." Then nothing. Complete silence. So abrupt it felt like the forest had swallowed the sound mid-sentence. "John!" I shouted, fighting to get out of my sleeping bag and locate my flashlight in the darkness. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the zipper of my tent, and I could hear Sean moving frantically in his own setup, gear clattering as he scrambled to get outside. I burst out of my tent with my LED flashlight cutting a white beam through the darkness. Sean came out at the same time, his own light moving toward John's tent. The blue fabric hung loose and shapeless, and even from 15 feet away I could see something was wrong with the shape. "John!" Sean shouted, running toward the tent with his flashlight bouncing wild patterns across the trees. "John, answer me!" I followed close behind, my bare feet stumbling over roots and rocks as we rushed across the clearing. Sean reached John's tent first and dropped to his knees beside the entrance, pulling at the zipper with urgent, clumsy movements. "The back," I said, my light catching the rear panel of the tent. The fabric hung in tatters, ripped open in jagged tears that looked like they'd been made by something with massive claws. The sleeping bag inside was twisted and empty, and John's gear lay scattered across the tent floor. Sean crawled through the torn opening, his flashlight beam moving frantically across the small interior space. "He's not here. John's not here." I moved around to the damaged rear panel, kneeling to check the tears more closely. The cuts were clean and deliberate, made by something that could slice through reinforced camping fabric like tissue paper. Drops of something dark had soaked into the tent floor near the opening, and the metallic smell made my stomach turn. "Look at this," I said, pointing my light at the ground just outside the torn tent. The pine needles and soft earth were disturbed in a clear pattern leading away from John's tent toward the tree line. Not footprints exactly, but dents and scuffed areas that looked like something heavy had been dragged across the ground. The trail was maybe 3 feet wide and pressed deep enough into the forest floor that whatever had made it had considerable weight and strength. "We have to follow it," Sean said, crawling back out of the tent. He had his hunting knife in his hand, the blade reflecting our flashlight beams as he stood up. "We have to find him." "John," I called into the darkness beyond our camp, my voice echoing off the trees and returning as a hollow mockery. "John, where are you?" No response came back except the continued silence that had been bothering us since we'd left the marked trail. Sean was already moving toward the drag marks, his flashlight beam following the disturbed ground as it led deeper into the forest. I grabbed my jacket from inside my tent and followed him, my own light adding to his as we traced the trail away from our clearing. The marks were easier to follow than I'd expected. Whatever had taken John hadn't bothered to hide its path. Broken branches hung at odd angles, plants were flattened in a straight line, and deeper gouges in the soft earth showed where something had been hauled through the forest with tremendous force. "John!" Sean shouted again, his voice cracking with strain. "John, answer me!" 20 yards from our camp, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye and turned my flashlight toward a gap between 2 huge pine trunks. The beam lit up nothing but darkness and tree bark. But for just a moment I could have sworn I'd seen something large moving between the shadows. Something that moved too smoothly to be human and too deliberately to be a normal forest animal. "Did you see that?" I whispered, keeping my light trained on the spot where I thought I'd seen movement. Sean stopped walking and turned to follow my beam. "See what?" "Something moving, over there between those trees." We stood frozen for several seconds, both of our lights focused on the same area of forest. But nothing moved. Nothing reflected our beams back at us. Just pine trunks and bushes and the heavy darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reveal anything useful. "Keep moving," Sean said, but his voice was tight with tension. "We have to find the trail." We continued following the drag marks for another 50 yards, calling John's name every few steps and looking around the trees with our flashlights. The trail led generally downhill, winding between the larger trees and following what might have been a game path if it hadn't been so obviously disturbed by something much larger than deer or elk. The marks ended abruptly at a rocky outcrop where the ground turned from soft earth to bare stone. Sean knelt at the edge of the rocks, running his hands over the surface and angling his flashlight to catch any scratches or disturbances that might indicate which direction the trail continued. "Anything?" I asked, sweeping my own light across the rocky area. "Nothing. The trail just stops." Sean stood up and turned in a slow circle, his knife still gripped in his right hand and his flashlight cutting frantic arcs through the darkness. How does something just disappear like that? We spent the next hour searching in expanding circles from the rocky outcrop, calling John's name until our voices grew hoarse and our throats burned from the effort. Every shadow looked threatening in our flashlight beams. Every gap between trees seemed to hide something that might be watching us. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched from the darkness beyond our lights. The silence continued to press down around us, unnatural and heavy, making every footstep and every word seem unnaturally loud in the still air. "This is impossible," Sean muttered as we worked our way through a dense stand of young pines. "Nothing moves a grown man that quietly. Nothing takes someone without leaving more of a trail." But something had done exactly that, and we both knew it even if Sean wasn't ready to admit what that meant. John had been taken by something that had the strength to tear through camping fabric like paper, the size to drag a full-grown man through thick forest, and the intelligence to cover its tracks when it reached rocky ground. As the first pale hints of dawn began to filter through the trees overhead, exhaustion finally forced us to slow our frantic searching. Our flashlight batteries were running low, and we'd covered every bit of ground within reasonable distance of our camp without finding any trace of John or whatever had taken him. "We need to go back," I said, though the words felt like giving up on my friend. "Regroup. Figure out what to do next." Sean nodded reluctantly, his face pale and streaked with sweat from hours of desperate searching. The military precision that usually defined his movements had broken down into jerky, tired motions that showed just how badly the night had shaken him. We were walking back toward our camp when my flashlight beam caught a flash of familiar color hanging from a branch about 20 feet off the ground. Blue fabric, the same shade as John's backpack, trapped on the jagged end of a broken pine branch near what looked like a steep cliff face. "There," I said, pointing up at the fabric. "That's John's pack." Sean followed my light and saw the backpack caught high in the tree, maybe 50 yards from where we'd made camp. The pack hung at an impossible angle, like it had been thrown or dropped from something much taller than a human, and one of the shoulder straps was completely torn away. "How the hell did it get up there?" Sean asked, but he was already looking around for a way to climb the tree. It took us 20 minutes to work our way up the pine trunk, using lower branches as handholds and bracing against the rough bark with our boots. The backpack was caught more securely than it had looked from the ground, wedged between two branches and tangled in a way that suggested it had hit the tree with considerable force. Sean managed to work it free while I held my flashlight steady to light up his efforts. When he finally pulled the pack loose, we could see the extent of the damage. Deep tears ran through the main compartment, and one side panel was completely shredded. Whatever had torn the fabric had done so with the same clean precision we'd seen in John's tent. We climbed back down to solid ground and looked at the contents. John's wallet was still there, along with a handful of energy bars and some loose camping gear. But his flask was gone, and most of his personal items had disappeared through the tears in the fabric. Sean held the damaged pack and looked down at the cliff face that dropped away into darkness below our position. The drop was steep enough that I couldn't see the bottom even when I angled my flashlight downward, and loose rocks scattered when I accidentally kicked them over the edge. "This is impossible," Sean whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of wind moving through the pine branches. "Nothing could move that fast. Nothing could carry someone up here and then..." He gestured vaguely at the cliff face, his hands shaking visibly in the pale morning light. But we both knew that something had done exactly that. Something had taken John from his tent, dragged him through 50 yards of forest, and somehow gotten him up into these trees before what? I didn't want to think about what might have happened to my friend on this cliff face in the darkness. The reality of our situation hit me hard as I stood there holding the torn pieces of John's backpack. My friend was gone. Something had taken him in the night, something large and strong and smart enough to cover its tracks and disappear into the wilderness like it had never existed. I looked at Sean, hoping to see some trace of his military confidence returning now that we had daylight to work with. But his face was pale, and his hands were still shaking as he stared down into the darkness below the cliff. For the first time since we'd left the marked trail, he looked genuinely terrified rather than just frustrated or worried. We were lost in the wilderness, with something hunting us, and now we were down to two. Sean dropped John's torn backpack and stepped backward from the cliff edge like the fabric had burned his hands. His breathing came in short, sharp bursts, and I watched his eyes dart frantically between the trees surrounding us. "We need immediate extraction," he muttered, pulling out his compass and studying it with shaking hands. "Radio for evac. GPS coordinates to base." "Sean, what are you talking about?" He started pacing in tight circles around the backpack, his movements jerky and upset. "Standard protocol for hostile contact. Fall back to rally point. Request air support." His voice carried the clipped sounds of military communication, but the words made no sense for our situation. I knelt and picked up John's damaged pack, examining the clean tears in the fabric. The torn material looked cold and damp, and dark stains had soaked into several areas. "Sean, we need to think about this. Maybe we should wait here. Mark this location somehow. When the rescue teams come looking—" "No rescue teams," Sean snapped, whirling to face me. His face was pale and his pupils looked dilated. "No radio contact. We're compromised. Hostile forces have superior positioning and night vision capabilities." The military jargon poured out of him in a steady stream as he paced faster, his hands moving constantly to check his compass, adjust his pack straps, touch the knife on his belt. Everything about his posture screamed panic barely held in check by trained responses that didn't apply to our current crisis. "We break down camp immediately," he announced, already walking back toward our tents. "Movement in 15 minutes. Maintain noise discipline and light discipline at all times." I followed him down from the cliff area, John's backpack in my hands. Sean was moving fast and efficiently, but his efficiency had a frantic quality that made me nervous. He pulled up his tent stakes with violent jerks and stuffed his sleeping bag into his pack without bothering to roll it properly. "Sean, slow down. We should think about this." "No time for thinking." He yanked his tent down and began cramming it into his pack. Delay means death. Every minute we stay stationary increases hostile contact probability. I set John's pack aside and started taking down my own tent, but Sean's panic was getting to me. My hand shook as I worked the stakes loose from the hard ground, and I kept looking over my shoulder at the tree line, expecting something large to come out from between the pine trees. Sean finished packing in record time and stood at the edge of our former campsite, his pack on his shoulders and his compass in his hand. He looked around the forest like he was checking for enemy positions, his head moving in quick, systematic sweeps. "Movement vector southwest," he announced. "Maintain 10-meter intervals, no unnecessary communication." "Wait," I said, still struggling with my tent poles. "We should leave some kind of marker here, something to show search teams where we've been." Sean turned to look at me, and his eyes had that wild look I'd seen in news footage of soldiers suffering from combat stress. "No markers, no trail indicators. Enemy forces will use them for tracking." "What hostile forces?" "Sean, there's no enemy here. We're lost hikers, not soldiers." But he wasn't listening. He started walking rapidly downhill, moving through the bushes with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to navigate hostile territory. His head continued those systematic sweeps, checking behind us every few steps like he expected pursuit. I grabbed my pack and John's damaged one, hurrying to catch up. Sean was setting a pace that made conversation impossible, forcing his way through thick areas of brush and jumping over fallen logs with nervous energy. Every few minutes he'd stop abruptly and hold up his hand for silence, listening to the continued unnatural quiet of the forest around us. "Contacts to the north," he'd whisper, though I heard nothing. "Multiple bogies. Maintain movement." The military talk was getting worse, not better. Sean was pulling back deeper into some kind of trained response that treated our situation like a combat zone rather than a wilderness emergency. When branches cracked under our feet, he'd freeze and look around the trees like snipers might be positioned overhead. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when Sean suddenly stopped and dropped into a crouch behind a large pine trunk. He motioned for me to get down, his eyes fixed on something ahead of us that I couldn't see. "Hostile movement," he whispered. "2 contacts, maybe 3, flanking maneuver in progress." I crouched beside him and strained to see whatever had caught his attention. The forest ahead looked empty to me, just more pine trunks and bushes disappearing into the shadows. But Sean was watching with the intensity of someone who believed his life depended on it. "I don't see anything," I whispered back. "They're there, standard hunting pattern. We need to break contact immediately." Sean rose from his crouch and started moving again, but now his pace was even faster and his route more erratic. He'd change direction suddenly, backtrack for no apparent reason, and stop to listen at random intervals. The man who'd confidently led us off the marked trail 2 days ago had completely disappeared, replaced by someone who saw threats in every shadow. My legs were starting to ache from the sustained pace, and the straps of both backpacks were cutting into my shoulders. Sean showed no signs of slowing down, and when I called out for a rest break, he just motioned urgently for me to keep moving. We were descending a particularly steep section of hillside when my foot caught on an exposed root. I went down hard, my ankle twisting underneath me as both packs went flying. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and immediate, and I couldn't help crying out. Sean didn't stop. He was maybe 20 yards ahead of me, still moving downhill with that rapid, nervous energy. I called his name, but he either didn't hear me or was too locked into his panic response to acknowledge my situation. I pulled myself up against a tree trunk and tested weight on my injured ankle. The pain was manageable, but definitely present, and my boot felt tighter than it should. Not broken, probably, but twisted enough to slow me down significantly. "Sean!" I shouted, loud enough that my voice echoed off the surrounding trees. "I'm hurt! Sean, wait up!" But when I looked downhill, I couldn't see him anywhere. The forest had swallowed him completely, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the heavy silence that had been following us since we'd left the marked trail. I gathered both backpacks and started limping downhill, following what I hoped was Sean's path through the bushes, but within a few minutes I'd lost any clear sign of his passage, and the forest all looked the same, pine trunks and shadows and thick brush that could hide anything. "Sean!" I called again, but my voice just bounced back at me as a hollow echo. He was gone, disappeared into the wilderness like John had been taken from his tent. But this time there was no drag marks, no torn fabric, no evidence of struggle. Sean had simply walked away and left me behind. I reached a rocky stream bed where any footprints would have been wiped away by the flowing water. Both directions looked equally empty and equally scary. I had no way of knowing which way Sean had gone, no idea how to find him or get back to any landmark I recognized. My situation hit me hard. I was completely alone in the wilderness, injured and lost, with something hostile moving through these trees. John was dead. Sean had left me, and I had no idea how to get back to civilization or even how to signal for help. I sat down heavily on a moss-covered rock beside the stream and tried to think clearly about my options. But every shadow between the trees looked like it might hide something large and patient. Every sound made me freeze and listen for footsteps or breathing that didn't belong to me. The forest felt different now that I was alone, bigger somehow and more scary. The trees pressed in around me, and the continued silence made every small noise seem unnaturally loud. My own breathing, the rustle of fabric when I moved, the splash of water over rocks. Everything bounced in the still air like announcements of my location. I stood up and started walking downstream, hoping the water might eventually lead to a road or a ranger station or some sign of human civilization. But each step on my twisted ankle sent fresh pain up my leg, and the heavy packs made my balance uncertain on the uneven stream bank. Something moved in the trees ahead of me, just a quick motion in my peripheral vision. I stopped walking and strained to see what had caught my attention, but the shadows showed nothing except more pine trunks and brush. My hands were shaking as I adjusted the pack straps and continued walking. Whatever had taken John was still out there, still moving through these trees with that patient intelligence I'd felt watching us since we'd left the marked trail. And now I was alone with it, limping through hostile territory with no backup and no way to call for help. The sound of my own footsteps on wet rocks seemed to bounce forever in the unnatural quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was matching my pace just beyond the range of my vision, following me, hunting me. The sun went down behind the pine trees while I limped along the rocky stream bed, and the temperature dropped fast in the mountain air. My injured ankle hurt with each step, and both backpacks felt heavy. The forest grew darker by the minute, changing from green shadows into a thick wall of black shapes that could hide anything. I'd been walking for hours without any sign of Sean or civilization. The stream wound through thick stands of pine and fir, occasionally splitting around rocky islands before joining itself downstream. I had no idea if I was going the right direction or just getting more lost with every painful step. My flashlight beam cut through the growing darkness, lighting up patches of wet rocks and overhanging branches. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen for sounds of rescue teams or other hikers, but the weird silence continued to press down around me. No insects, no night birds, no small animals moving through the bushes. Just the constant murmur of water over stones and my own heavy breathing. The rocky stream bed gave way to softer ground as the water carved its way through a depression between two hillsides. Pine trees grew thicker here, their branches connecting overhead to block out what little starlight might have filtered through. My flashlight became the only source of light in a world that seemed designed to swallow light and sound equally. I was focusing on placing my feet carefully to avoid twisting my ankle worse when the smell hit me. That same sweet, rotten odor I'd first encountered near our campsite, but stronger now. Much stronger. The stench rolled up from somewhere ahead of me, making my eyes water and my stomach clench. I stopped walking and pressed my sleeve against my nose, but the smell got through everything. The stream bed went down more steeply here, carved into what looked like a natural ravine maybe 20 feet deep. I could hear water running below me, but my flashlight beam couldn't reach far enough to show the bottom. The smell was definitely coming from down there, carried up on currents of cold air that made me shiver. I should have turned around. Every instinct I had screamed at me to go back the way I'd come, find higher ground, get away from whatever was producing that horrible odor. But I was lost and exhausted and running out of options. The stream was my only landmark, my only hope of finding a way out of this wilderness. I worked my way down the steep bank, using tree roots and rocks as handholds, while my flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead of me. The smell got worse with every step, until I was breathing through my mouth and fighting the urge to throw up. My injured ankle nearly gave out twice on the loose stones, sending sharp pain up my leg. The bottom of the ravine opened into a small clearing maybe 30 feet across, with the stream running through the center in a series of shallow pools. Dense bushes grew up the sides where pine roots created natural terraces, and fallen logs formed a jumbled maze of rotting wood. My flashlight swept across the clearing, and I stopped breathing. Bones were scattered everywhere. Human bones mixed with animal remains, some still connected by dried tissue and others picked completely clean. Rib cages lay cracked open like broken baskets. Skulls stared at me from the bases of trees, their empty sockets reflecting my light. Fresh carcasses in various stages of decay were piled between the older remains, creating a death house that stretched across the entire clearing. I counted at least 6 human skulls in my initial sweep, though more bones went into the shadows beyond my light. Some of the remains looked recent enough that scraps of clothing still clung to them. Others had been here long enough for moss to grow over the exposed bone surfaces. But it was the center of the clearing that made my legs go weak. John's head sat upright on a flat rock like some kind of horrible trophy. His brown hair was matted with blood and dirt, but his features were unmistakable. His eyes were wide open, staring directly at me with an expression of absolute terror frozen across his face. His mouth hung open in what must have been a final scream, and dark stains covered his neck where it had been cut from his body. I dropped both backpacks and threw up until my stomach was completely empty. The acidic taste mixed with the overwhelming smell of death and decay, making me gag repeatedly even after nothing was left to come up. My hands shook as I wiped my mouth and tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just a feeding ground. The bones were too organized, too deliberately arranged. Human skulls positioned facing outward like guards. Animal bones stacked in neat piles according to size. John's head placed at the exact center like the focal point of some twisted display. something large crashed through the branches above me. I jerked my flashlight upward and caught a massive shape dropping from the pine trees. It hit the ground with a heavy thud that I felt through the soles of my boots, landing maybe 10 feet away from where I stood, frozen among the scattered bones. The creature rose to its full height, and my flashlight beam lit up something that my mind couldn't immediately process. It stood at least 8 feet tall, with a body that was broadly human-like but wrong in every important detail. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that looked almost human, except for the black claws extending from each finger. Its legs were too long and bent at angles that suggested joints different from human anatomy. But it was the face that made my blood freeze. The features were human enough to be recognizable, but twisted into something that belonged in nightmares. The bone structure looked like someone had taken a human skull and stretched it vertically while flattening the forehead. Its nose was little more than 2 dark slits above a mouth, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. Yellow eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's, but they held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. The thing studied me with those horrible eyes, its head tilting slightly like a predator evaluating potential prey. Dark hair or fur-covered parts of its body in patches, but large areas of pale skin showed through. Its breathing was deep and deliberate, creating small clouds of vapor in the cold mountain air. I tried to run. My legs responded like they were moving through thick water, but somehow I turned and stumbled toward the ravine wall. Behind me, the creature made a sound that was almost like laughter, a low, rumbling growl that held far too much amusement. I scrambled up the steep bank, my injured ankle screaming with pain as I hauled myself over rocks and through tangled bushes. My flashlight beam swung wildly as I climbed, creating a strobe effect that made the forest around me seem to flash in and out of existence. Heavy footsteps followed me up the ravine wall, but they weren't urgent. The creature was moving at a deliberate pace, like it knew exactly where I was going and didn't feel any need to hurry. When I reached the top of the bank and looked back, its yellow eyes shined in the darkness just a few yards behind me. I ran blindly through the forest, crashing through branches that tore at my clothes and face. My flashlight beam bounced ahead of me, revealing pine trunks and bushes that all looked identical in the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the thing moving through the trees with an ease that spoke to years of hunting in this area. Every few minutes, I'd catch a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision, always just at the edge of my light. Sometimes it was directly behind me, matching my pace with those long, measured steps. Other times, it appeared off to my left or right, having somehow circled around to approach from a different angle. It could have caught me easily, but it seemed to be enjoying the chase. I stumbled over fallen logs and crashed through thick patches of bushes, my lungs burning and my legs cramping from the sustained effort. My injured ankle sent sharp pain up my leg with every step, but adrenaline kept me moving when exhaustion should have dropped me to the ground. The creature stayed with me through it all, sometimes close enough that I could hear its breathing, other times going away completely before reappearing from an unexpected direction. It was playing with me, letting me think I might escape before cutting off my route or appearing ahead of me in the darkness. I ran for what felt like hours, though time became meaningless in the endless succession of pine trunks and shadows. My flashlight beam grew dimmer as the batteries drained, turning from white to yellow to a weak orange glow that barely lit up the ground in front of me. Finally, my legs gave out completely. I collapsed against the trunk of a massive pine, my chest heaving and my whole body shaking with exhaustion. My injured ankle had swollen inside my boot until every step was agony, and blood ran down my face from dozens of cuts where branches had caught me in my blind flight. The weak beam of my dying flashlight barely reached 10 feet in front of me, creating a small circle of orange light in an ocean of darkness. I pressed my back against the rough bark and tried to catch my breath while waiting for the inevitable. The creature came out from the shadows just beyond my light, moving with that same deliberate patience it had shown throughout the chase. Its yellow eyes caught what little light remained from my flashlight, reflecting back at me like twin suns in the darkness. It began circling me, staying just outside the range of my failing light, but close enough that I could hear its heavy breathing and the soft sound of its clawed feet on the pine needles. The breathing had a rhythmic quality that was almost like laughter, and the sounds it made as it moved around me carried an unmistakable note of satisfaction. I sat there waiting for death, my back pressed against the tree trunk, and my useless flashlight clutched in shaking hands. The creature continued its slow circle, taking its time, savoring the moment before it finished what it had started when it took John from his tent. The low growling sounds it made were definitely laughter now, rumbling through the darkness like the purr of some massive predatory cat. It had run me to ground, played with me until I had nothing left, and now it was enjoying my terror before moving in for the kill. My flashlight finally died completely, throwing me into total darkness. The creature's breathing got closer, and I heard the soft scrape of claws against bark as it got ready for the final attack. The rhythmic growling stopped, replaced by a deeper sound that went through my chest, something between a purr and a snarl that told me the game was over. I pressed myself harder against the rough pine bark and closed my eyes, waiting for those massive claws to tear through me like they'd torn through John's tent. The forest held its breath around us, that same unnatural silence that had followed us since we'd left the marked trail 3 days ago. Then I heard it, a distant mechanical sound that didn't belong in the wilderness, the steady whop, whop, whop of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. The creature's breathing changed, becoming agitated and uncertain. I opened my eyes but saw nothing in the complete darkness, though I could feel its presence just feet away from where I sat, broken against the tree. The helicopter sound got louder, joined by a second set of rotors approaching from a different direction. Bright white lights suddenly blazed through the pine trees, sweeping back and forth in systematic search patterns that turned the forest into a strobing maze of lit branches and moving shadows. A voice boomed through a megaphone, distorted but unmistakably human. "This is Shasta County Search and Rescue. If you can hear this, make noise or shine a light to signal your location." The creature let out a roar that seemed to come from its very core, a sound of pure rage and frustration that bounced off the surrounding trees and went through the ground beneath me. I heard the heavy thud of its feet as it moved away from my position, crashing through bushes with none of the silent grace it had displayed during our deadly game of cat and mouse. "Here!" I screamed, though my voice came out as barely more than a croak. "I'm here! Help me!" The searchlights kept sweeping through the trees while voices called back and forth between ground teams. I could hear people moving through the forest, breaking branches and calling out coordinates. The mechanical sounds of civilization, radios crackling, equipment clanking, engines running, filled the air where only death and silence had existed moments before. A beam of white light found me through the trees, and I waved my arms frantically while croaking out another desperate call for help. The light locked onto my position, and I heard voices directing other team members toward my location. 3 people in orange safety vests came out of the darkness, carrying powerful LED flashlights and wearing heavy packs loaded with rescue equipment. The first man reached me and immediately dropped to one knee, checking my pulse while speaking into a radio clipped to his shoulder. "We've got him," he said. "Adult male, conscious and responsive, multiple lacerations, possible ankle injury, signs of severe dehydration and exhaustion." "The creature," I babbled, grabbing his arm with shaking hands. 8 feet tall, yellow eyes. It killed my friend. It was going to kill me. The rescuer's expression shifted to practiced concern as he gently pried my fingers loose from his jacket. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of here." "You don't understand," I insisted, my words tumbling over each other. "There's something in these woods. It's not human. It took John and tore him apart, and it was playing with me, hunting me." "Sir, you need to stay calm. another rescuer said, kneeling beside me and opening a medical kit. "You've been through a terrible ordeal. We're going to take care of you." They worked quickly around me, checking my injuries and getting me ready for transport. One of them put a splint on my swollen ankle while another cleaned the worst cuts on my face and arms. I kept trying to tell them about the creature, about the clearing full of bones, about John's cut-off head staring at me with frozen terror. They listened with the patient expressions of people trained to handle trauma victims, nodding and making reassuring sounds while they wrapped me in emergency blankets and prepared a stretcher. But I could see in their eyes that they thought I was seeing things, that my mind had broken under the stress of being lost in dangerous wilderness. The helicopter evacuation was a blur of rotor wash and engine noise. They strapped me to a backboard and hoisted me up through the trees in a rescue basket, the forest spinning away beneath me in a maze of searchlights and moving figures. Through the aircraft's open door, I could see other teams going through the woods with their bright beams, searching for signs of John or Sean. Mercy Medical Center in Redding smelled like disinfectant and floor wax, a clean, antiseptic environment that felt like another planet after 3 days in the wilderness. They wheeled me into an emergency room bay where doctors and nurses moved around me with practiced skill, asking questions I could barely focus on answering. "Severe dehydration," I heard someone say. "Exhaustion, multiple lacerations, sprained ankle, possible head trauma." They started an IV and began cleaning my wounds properly, stitching up the deeper cuts while a doctor looked at my eyes with a small flashlight. The medical staff spoke in calm, professional tones, but I caught the meaningful looks they exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. Over the next few days, as my body slowly got better from the ordeal, I learned what had happened after Sean disappeared into the wilderness. A ranger at the Crater Lake station had found him stumbling out of the forest, dehydrated and confused, sometime during the second night of our trip. Sean had told them there were 2 other hikers still missing in the backcountry, triggering the massive search operation that had ultimately saved my life. But Sean wouldn't give details about how he'd escaped or what had happened to John. According to the ranger I spoke with, he just kept repeating that we'd gotten separated and that something had attacked our camp. When pressed for specifics, Sean would shut down completely, staring at the wall and refusing to answer any more questions. The official search teams found John's remains exactly where I'd described them, in the ravine clearing surrounded by scattered bones. But the report classified his death as a bear attack, noting the unusual mutilation, but attributing it to aggressive feeding behavior. The human remains they'd found were identified as belonging to several missing hikers who disappeared in the area over the past few years, all officially explained as wilderness accidents or predator encounters. I tried to visit Sean in the hospital, but the nursing staff told me he'd turned down all visitors and wouldn't speak to anyone about what we'd experienced. He checked himself out against medical advice on his 3rd day there and left no forwarding address. When I asked the rangers if they had any way to contact him, they said he'd specifically requested that his location be kept private. The police detective who took my statement was professional but skeptical. I told him everything, about leaving the marked trail, about the claw marks and the unnatural silence, about the creature that had hunted us through the forest like some kind of intelligent predator. He wrote it all down dutifully, but I could see the doubt in his eyes when I described the thing's human-like face and calculated behavior. "Mr. Miller," he said when I finished, "you've been through an extremely traumatic experience. It's not uncommon for survivors to have difficulty processing what they've witnessed. Sometimes our minds fill in details that help us make sense of senseless tragedy." The park rangers who interviewed me were even more direct in their disbelief. They explained that black bears in the area could reach significant size and that attacks, while rare, sometimes resulted in severe injuries that could seem almost systematic to traumatized witnesses. When I insisted that no bear could have done what I'd seen, they suggested I might benefit from counseling to help process my wilderness trauma. No one believed me about what I'd really seen in those woods. To everyone else, I was just another hiker who'd ignored safety protocols and paid the price. a trauma victim whose mind had created monsters to explain a tragedy that was simply the result of bad decisions and bad luck. But I knew what I'd witnessed in that clearing. I knew what had walked around me in the darkness, what had made those deliberate sounds of amusement while it played with my terror. The creature was real, and it was still out there, waiting in the dark between the trees for the next group of hikers who thought they knew better than the people who'd marked those trails for a reason. I stared at the hospital discharge papers in my apartment, looking at the same words for the 5th time, without processing any of them. 2 weeks had passed since the rescue, but my hands still shook when I held anything made of paper. The official documents recommended follow-up care and counseling, using phrases like wilderness trauma and acute stress reaction that reduced what I'd experienced to clinical terminology. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, displaying my company's employee portal. I'd been on medical leave since the rescue, but my sick days were running out and my boss had started calling about when I'd return to work. The thought of sitting in that fluorescent-lit office, pretending to care about spreadsheets and quarterly reports while John's frozen expression haunted my peripheral vision, made my stomach clench. I clicked through the resignation process, filling out forms that asked for reasons and offered exit interview opportunities. None of the drop-down menus had an option for hunted by an 8-foot monster that no one believes exists. I selected personal reasons and submitted everything electronically, cutting my last tie to the life I'd lived before those 3 days in the wilderness. Sleep had become impossible in the apartment. Every shadow that moved across my bedroom wall looked like something large and predatory positioning itself for an attack. The building's old pipes creaked and groaned throughout the night, and each sound made me freeze under my covers, listening for the deliberate footsteps I'd heard circling me in the forest. I'd replaced all the locks on my doors and windows, but the security measures felt meaningless against something that could tear through reinforced tent fabric like it was tissue paper. My neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind. Mrs. Patterson from across the hall had started avoiding eye contact after she'd found me checking the stairwell at 3 a.m, flashlight in hand, searching for signs that something had gotten into the building. The apartment complex backed up against a small grove of eucalyptus trees, and I couldn't stop staring at that tree line through my living room window, watching for movement that didn't belong. I spent the next week packing everything I owned into cardboard boxes. Most of my possessions felt pointless now. Books I'd never read again, kitchen gadgets for meals I'd never cook, decorative items that belonged to someone who used to care about making a space feel like home. I kept only the essentials: clothes, a few personal documents, my laptop, and the camping gear that had survived our disastrous trip. The rest went to charity or the dumpster. Loading my Honda with everything that remained of my old life took less than 2 hours. The car barely had room for me to see out the rear window, but I didn't plan on looking back anyway. I pulled out of the apartment complex parking lot just as the morning commute was starting, joining a stream of normal people heading to normal jobs in a normal world where the most dangerous thing they'd encounter was bad traffic. I drove east on Highway 80, putting distance between myself and the Shasta Trinity wilderness. Every mile felt like a small victory, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pacing me just beyond the range of my mirrors. The known landscapes of Northern California gave way to Nevada desert, then Utah mountains, and finally the approaching skyline of Denver. I chose the city because it was far from any serious wilderness, surrounded by open plains where nothing could approach unseen. The apartment I rented sat in a bland complex near the airport, chosen specifically because it backed up against a parking lot rather than trees. My new neighbors were flight attendants and airport workers who kept irregular schedules, which meant fewer questions about why I came and went at strange hours, or why I sometimes stood on my balcony at midnight, checking the empty asphalt for signs of movement. Finding work proved easier than I'd expected. A warehouse operation near the freight terminals hired me without asking too many questions about my employment gap. The job involved moving boxes from trucks to shelves in a building that stayed brightly lit 24 hours a day. perfect for someone who'd developed an aversion to shadows and unlit spaces. The physical labor helped exhaust my body enough that I could sometimes manage 3 or 4 hours of sleep before the nightmares started. I'd dream about John's severed head staring at me from that rock, or about yellow eyes watching me from just beyond my dying flashlight beam. Sometimes I'd dream that the creature had followed me to Denver, that it was standing outside my apartment building, learning my patterns, and waiting for the right moment to finish what it had started. My research into the Shasta Trinity area became an obsession that filled my sleepless hours. Online forums dedicated to missing persons cases contained dozens of reports spanning back decades. Hikers who'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind abandoned campsites and personal belongings scattered through the forest. Search teams would find torn clothing and sometimes partial remains, but the official explanations always cited wildlife encounters or accidents. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Single hikers or small groups would disappear after leaving marked trails, usually during multi-day wilderness excursions. The missing persons reports described experienced outdoors people who knew the terrain, not novice hikers likely to get lost or make fatal mistakes. Yet the investigations invariably concluded with phrases like presumed dead due to exposure or likely predator encounter. I found 3 newspaper articles from the past 5 years alone describing unusual bear attacks in the same general area where we'd been hiking. The victims showed extensive trauma that wildlife experts struggled to explain, with injuries that seemed too systematic for typical animal feeding behavior. One article quoted a Forest Service official who admitted that the attack patterns were unlike anything we've documented in this region, but the investigation had still concluded that an abnormally large black bear was responsible. Sean's name never appeared in any of these reports. I searched for him using every combination of terms I could think of: Sean Brooks, military veterans in the Redding area, hospital admissions from our rescue date. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished completely after walking out of that hospital. Part of me wondered if he'd changed his name and moved somewhere far away, trying to outrun the same memories that haunted my sleep. The warehouse job settled into a routine that kept me functional, but barely human. Clock in at 6 in the evening, move boxes until 2 in the morning, drive home through empty streets while checking my mirrors constantly. I developed a system of checking every lock in my apartment multiple times before attempting sleep, testing windows and examining the balcony for signs that anything had tried to climb up from the parking lot below. My coworkers were mostly younger guys saving money for college or supporting families on second jobs. They made friendly attempts at conversation during breaks, but I deflected their questions about my background and kept interactions professional. How could I explain that I'd moved across the country to escape something that had torn my friend apart and turned him into a trophy in a forest clearing? Better to be thought antisocial than insane. 3 months into my new routine, I was scheduled for a late shift that would run until dawn. The warehouse felt different at night, with fewer people and long stretches of silence broken only by the buzz of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of freight trains. I'd grown comfortable with the known environment, the predictable layout of aisles and loading docks that offered no hiding places for anything larger than a forklift. During my midnight break, I stepped outside into the loading area to clear my head. The Denver air was dry and thin compared to California's coastal humidity, carrying the industrial smells of diesel fuel and hot asphalt. Security lights lit up the immediate area around the building, but beyond their reach, darkness stretched toward the airport perimeter and the distant glow of the city. I was halfway through my 15-minute break when the wind changed. The smell hit me. That same sweet, rotten odor I'd first encountered near our campsite, but stronger and more concentrated than I remembered. My blood turned to ice water as recognition flooded through every cell in my body. The distinctive stench of decay and something else. Something alive and predatory that had marked its territory with death. I spun around, checking the parking lot and the tree line beyond it with eyes that suddenly saw threats in every shadow. The loading dock security lights created pools of light separated by areas of complete darkness, perfect hiding spots for something that had learned to use shadows as camouflage. My hands trembled as I searched for any sign of movement, any indication that the nightmare from the Shasta wilderness had somehow tracked me across 800 miles of open country. The smell lingered on the wind for several more seconds before disappearing, leaving me standing alone under the harsh security lights with the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone at all. Something was out there, watching me from beyond the range of the warehouse lighting. Something that knew exactly who I was and where I'd tried to hide. I backed toward the building's entrance, never taking my eyes off the darkness that surrounded our little island of electric light. I reached for the door handle, and for a moment, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement near the fence line, something large moving position among the shadows. The next morning, I gave my supervisor 2 weeks' notice and started planning my next move east. But even as I researched apartments in Kansas City and St. Louis, I knew the truth that I'd been avoiding since that night in the forest. The creature hadn't just hunted me for sport or food. It had marked me somehow, claimed me as prey that belonged to it alone. No matter how far I ran or how many cities I put between myself and those mountains, it would always be out there, patient and intelligent and completely dedicated to finishing what it had started. The thing in the darkness had all the time in the world, and I was just postponing an inevitable confrontation that would end the same way it had almost ended in the wilderness, with my death feeding its twisted sense of satisfaction. But I packed my car anyway and drove toward the rising sun because the alternative was giving up completely. And somewhere deep in my mind, in the part that had survived 3 days of hell and lived to remember John's frozen scream, I wasn't quite ready to surrender yet.